The scream tore the night open like a cleaved moon, raw, unhuman, a sound that should have been heard by every throat in Edrin's court, and yet landed against the castle stones like something muffled under wool. Chaol's face crumpled, not because his ears could catch it, but because he could feel the tremor in the floor, the way plates jittered on the long table, the way the glass of water in his palm shivered as if someone had shaken the world. He closed his eyes against the sudden, volcanic worry on his father's face and read it all: anger, fear, the taut promise of retribution, and felt, with a precision that made his ribs ache, that this one moment would change everything. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're hollowing from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The hall smelled of smoke and iron, and the faint sweetness of someone's perfume clinging to velvet. Candles guttered. Courtiers froze like statues, each waiting for the Alpha to decide which of them would live under his mercy and which would not. King Edrin sat like wind-carved granite at the head of the table. His eyes were sharp as razors and narrower than Chaol had ever seen them. The scream had come from the outer courtyard, a messenger perhaps, or the hunters, but Edrin's clenched jaw told a boy trained in reading faces that this was not mere news. This was a rupture that could be plucked and spread through rival packs until the northern wilds hummed with war. They all looked at Chaol then, as if some law of the world demanded the prince bear witness by innate right. He felt their gazes like tiny pebbles landing on his skin. He could not hear the whispering currents of conversation that rose and stilled like tides. He could only feel the shiver in the air. He lowered his chin because to be looked at was another kind of violence. In the silence he'd learned to live within, attention burned like a lantern held too close. The palace had grown around his muteness like vines, beautiful, dangerous, and always present. Since birth, Chaol had been trained in the languages his people prized, the tilt of a shoulder that said obedience, the quick inhale that became aggression, the slow exhale that promised forbearance. He read breath like most of the court read heralds. He learned to translate a wolf palm on the shoulder into a covenant, and a hand curled on the table into a decision made. The healers had said the boy's inner ear was mute as stone. The seers had shrugged and turned their faces skyward. To his father, Chaol's silence had been a wound too deep to show mercy on. It was why Chaol moved through the palace like a faded tapestry, noticed for beauty but not believed to be of substance. Betas and sheriffs and lesser alphas tipped their heads to him the way one might to a relic, performative, wary. The rival pack leaders used his silence as a calculating tool. They could not be sure how a prince who did not hear commands might respond in battle. Doubt is a weapon sharper than any spear. Edrin had carved alliances with it. The whispers in the corridors were never kind. Fragile, they murmured. A boy with moonlight hair and a hollow where sound should be. A burden for the crown. Jonin smelled of mud and rain and the honest sweat of hands that had known work since they were small. He arrived at the palace under a sky that threatened storm, his satchel clutched like a talisman against the wind. The stable boys had sent him, an extra pair of hands to steady the horses when packs came to breed allegiance or to be shown off as trophies. He was not supposed to stand in any throne room or to be witnessed by an alpha more than once. Yet that first day, when Chaol had slipped from the long table to avoid the clamor of alphas and betas, their paths crossed by pure astrology. Their first exchange had been without words, a stable boy with calloused palms and a prince who knelt by the open door to watch the horses breathe. Chaol touched a dappled mare's flank and felt the animal's slow, rhythmic sigh. Jonin watched him with a curiosity that was neither fear nor sullen respect, something gentler, almost reverent. He had a way with animals that made the palace whisper. The wolves bent their heads to him like they had always been waiting for these human hands. Humans were not meant to tame wild blood, the elders said, yet the animals found Jonin a place of ease. For Chaol, whose world was a map of light and shadow, Jonin became a new corner. The boy's presence felt like sunlight warming a stone. Jonin's fingers moved in patterns that read like language, stroking a flank, mending a frayed rein, knotting leather with a speed that made the stablemaster's eyes narrow. He had no right to be noticed by alphas or prince, and yet he walked with a steady, unassuming rightness that made the king's hunters lower their gazes. They began to orbit each other. Practical tasks first. Jonan bringing water to where Kale tended the horses. Kale helping adjust saddles when Jonan's hands grew numb from the cold. Conversation between them was a dance of patched silence and careful gesture. Kale signing words with hands as fluid as a river's turn. Jonan answering with soft, stubborn laughter and small gifts. A horseshoe washed and polished, a scrap of bread, a carved wooden whistle. The whistle made no sound Kale could hear, but he felt its weight and the way Jonan's eyes lit when he opened his hand. There was something in those eyes that made Kale's chest loosen, something private that both of them treasured. It would have been easy, some nights, for their closeness to remain contained in those stolen minutes among hay and hooves.
In those moments, the court's rules blurred, and the outside world felt distant, a place where a prince who could not hear and a human who could not claim nobility existed on equal footing. The stable's lights slanted mellow and forgiving, the horses snorted in contentment, and the two boys shared warmth without promise. Kale learned to rest his fingers on Jonan's wrist and read the quick rhythm of his blood, a secret map that told him if the human was lying or laughing. Jonan taught Kale to braid a mare's tail, to feel for a trapped thistle, to hum quietly, even if the hum landed only on Jonan's lips and never found Kale's ears. Rumors are games among the powerful. Truths are the weapons they sharpen to blood. Once Edrin discovered that his son spent hours in the stables with a human, his patience contracted. The king's rules were carved in harder stone than his body. To transgress them was to call the pack's fragile loyalties into question. A human's touch on royal flesh carried possibilities that made the court fidget. Alliances could be bought with a hand, bloodlines could be rewritten, the purity of lycandom could be sullied. These were not mere superstitions, but political calculus. Edrin saw a boy he could not shape, and a human who could not be trusted. The silence might be a weakness to be exploited, or, if news spread that a human could alter a prince's condition, it would rewrite the map of power entirely. Yet before the court could strike, before treaties could be leaked and banners sewn, something impossible happened. It was small. A hand brushed Kale's throat as he laughed at Jonan's clumsy mimicry of a mare, an absent, instinctive movement, and the world realigned. Kale's skin prickled from wrist to collarbone, like a current finding a wire. A noise unlatched somewhere deep inside him, a soft, bewildered bell of sound that did not yet have a name. His eyes widened. For the first time in his life, he understood, in an animal, crystalline way, what wind and breath and human laughter tasted like. He stilled, feeling the residual vibration in his own throat, as if someone had placed a warm palm over a sleeping drum. Jonan froze too, a look of cautious triumph on his face that quickly folded into confusion when Kale's hand trembled against his own. Neither of them had language for the silver thread of possibility unfurling between them. It was not a roar or a healing, more like the beginning of dawn, where each color arrives tentative, wrong-footed, then whole. Edrin watched that exchange as a hawk watches a rabbit. The alpha's silence afterward was louder than any pronouncement. To him, a human's accidental correction of his son's state was not a miracle to be treasured, but a fissure that could split kingdoms. If a human touch could reawaken what healers had declared dead, then what of the claims and contracts that had bled the northern wilds into Edrin's law? Were packmates only flesh then? Could a human be the pivot upon which the throne turned? Kale felt the taste of salt on his tongue. Perhaps fear, perhaps the stirring of something new. He had learned to fold himself small for safety. The new sound in his head was fragile and bright as spun glass, and it threatened everything he had been taught to be. If he allowed the echo to expand, to fill the rooms and gates and wolf hallows accustomed to shouting and decree, he might save himself the humiliation of being useless, or he might become the fulcrum of a political storm that would shred Jonan and him alike. The decision gathered at the edge of his ribs like a cold stone. Speak and risk the crown choosing his future for him. Hold the miracle close and risk the world that had raised him. Behind the stone of Edrin's jaw, other faces shifted. Betas with folded arms, a rival alpha's emissary whose smile had sharpened at the news, and an old seer whose interest had suddenly turned from ritual to observation. The palace had always been a web, and the new thread between Kale and Jonan glowed enough to attract every spider. When dusk fell and the palace candles were set like small sentries, Kale walked to the stables as if by habit alone. The mare whickered at his touch. Jonan was there, a shadow by the hayloft,
hands stained with tar and courage. The warmth between them was no longer possible to pretend away. In the quiet, their silence began to speak, and for the first time in his life, Cale feared not the lack of sound, but what would happen if the court learned how to make him heard. Cale paused in the doorway as if the stable itself had become a kind of trial. The lantern smoke smelled like old bread and rain. The horses nickered and shifted. Jonan looked up from a loose bit, and in that simple motion the world contracted to the space between them. The human's hands were square and sure, the knuckles knotted with work. They trembled a fraction when he saw Cale's face, and in that tremor Cale read apology, fear, and something tender as moss. He stepped forward because staying away felt like betrayal to the small, fierce thing that had started in his chest. They moved close enough for the boy's breath to fog the space between them, close enough for Cale to feel the warmth that Jonan carried like a private son. "You shouldn't be here," Jonan signed, quick and sharp, his fingers betraying impatience that his voice tried to hide. He had learned to sign from watching Cale and stealing half gestures. The result was more earnest than elegant. Cale smiled because even that small, stubborn defiance felt like speech. Jonan's jaw worked. "They're watching," he said aloud, before catching himself and closing his mouth, as if sound was a net that could catch them and throw them to the court.
His voice, low, untrained, landed on Cale's new awareness like a thing stolen and gifted. For a second, Cale's world shimmered with color. The human cadence of the words, the way Jonan breathed between them, an aria of small noises, the scrape of leather, the rustle of straw, that formed a secret chorus only now he knew might be his. "You shouldn't be seen with me," Cale signed back, smaller. Each gesture measured because the real danger was not in the stable, but in the thought of their being seen. He tried, reflexively, to fold up his face the way he'd been taught, to make himself smaller. Jonan reached out and covered Cale's hands with calloused fingers. "I know," he murmured. Their hands stayed locked. For a moment it was simply heat and blood and the slow beat of two hearts conspiring against surfaces that had trained them to stay apart. Then Cale did something he had never done. He drew his palm up to his throat and let Jonan place his own hand there, over the hollow where the prince's pulse lay thin but steady. The contact was electric, like a line of moonlight skidding over a lake. Jonan breathed in, and Cale, who had once read language in breath instead of sound, found himself learning new dialects, the hitch that said nervous, the exhale that meant certainty. "Will you?" Jonan began, and stopped. And when he spoke again, it was clipped, embarrassed. "Will you let me try again? Please. I can't explain it. Not to them." This was the thing that made Cale want to give the world away. The human's earnestness, how he knelt like a supplicator before something sacred. He thought of his father, of Edrin's granite jaw and the way it would harden into law. He thought of rival alpha emissaries who would trade his life for a foothold, of betas who already plotted out heirs they believed strong enough to hold a pack. He thought of being used like a chess piece by men who called themselves leaders, men who would not hesitate to pawn away what they valued least. But when Jonan's hand resumed its place, warm and gentle, and hummed that half-note at the base of Cale's throat, something inside the prince unlatched like a door with loosened hinges. The sound the human made was not a grand salvation, it was a small, intimate thing. Half voice, half song, a sound born in the chest and shaped by the teeth and tongue. It was a thread, and Cale felt it weave itself through his bones. The world did not thunder open, yet. Instead, there was a layered hush, followed by the sudden, crystalline presence of a single small sound. The rustle of hay, the remnant of a horse's breath, Jonan's low, sheepish laugh when he tried and failed at making the right note. Cale's eyes glistened. He had never known that laughter could be precise enough to count as safety. He pressed his forehead against Jonan's palm, tasting the faint iron of the human skin, and the possibility of more pressed like dew on a blade of grass.
They sat there until the moon pushed a gray hand through the stable slats, and the world outside the barn became a silhouette of rumor and power. But nights are not safe because they are private. The palace remembers everything, even secrets whispered into horsehair. A sentry with a long memory and a tongue to match had seen them enter the stable together, and, later, had found the prince's cloaked footprints leading back toward the private wing. When the rumor reached Edrin, it came as a slow, cold thing. Not because the king could not forgive, Edrin could forgive only on terms he wrote, but because the notion of his sons being influenced by a human rewired years of politics with a single, jagged thought. Edrin's reaction was surgical. He called for counsel, for healers, for the seer whose eyes were milky with smoke and sight. They examined Cale with a clinical hunger that made the prince shrink. Fingers pressed and poked, instruments glinted like small accusing stars. The healers spoke in private and came out sounding like priests at a verdict. Some murmured of a neural mishearing, of dormant nerves waking. Others whispered about old magics, blessings or curses, given in misbegotten times to kings trying to sow loyalty through fear. "Let him be tested," Edrin said finally, his voice a blade wrapped in velvet. It was not a plea, but a directive. "If anything can be done to make him whole in the way the pack requires, we will know it." Cale's stomach fell. Testing was not about kindness, it was about demonstration. If he could be corrected, if the miracle could be repeated under watchful eyes, then his usefulness multiplied and his marriageability increased, and the pack's enemies had fewer words to twist into war. If it could not, then his silence would be turned over and magnified until it became a liability they could not afford. Jonan's place in the equation was even more precarious. A human who might hold the key to a prince's sound was either a bargaining chip or a traitor by association. Jonan never expected the palace to set the manner of his steps. The stable boy who had once welcomed the work of the court to feed his family now faced a summons that smelled of iron and law. He stood when the maid brought the escort and folded his hands like a condemned man. Cale watched him go, felt the way the human shoulders drew up as if bracing for a blow. That night the prince dreamt of wolves lining a crater with teeth that were coins. He woke with the taste of copper and the soft memory of Jonan's hum. Testing began with a parade of instruments and rituals. Healers used delicate bells and the scrape of obsidian to see how his body registered vibration. A seer asked Cale to stand beneath the moon and recite sounds he could not hear, recording the way his throat moved. Some methods were clinical, others anachronistic, threaded with superstition.
Through it all, Jonan was made to watch from the threshold like a man sentenced to look at his own life through a keyhole. The first experiment they performed involved a bronze cone that the lead healer pressed to the prince's skull and then banged like a mallet. The sound should have resonated through bone, translating into understanding, but Cale felt only the pressure and the slight headache after. When Jonan entered the room to stand by the window, his gaze was hot with a pleading that had no words. In one moment, against the healer's high-backed chairs, Cale saw the map of what this could become. If Jonan could be made to replicate the effect, if he could repeat that touch, that whisper, that hum, then he would be as dangerous as the gods. The court would either crown him as ally or crush him as heresy. Jonan approached the experiments with a humility that was almost unbearable. He offered his hands to be used as mediators in the trials, allowed the healers to fit him into contraptions, and sat through long hours as they compared his pulse to the prince's. When they required a demonstration, he did not balk. He placed his palm upon Cale's throat and hummed, low and steady. And sometimes, in the unguarded minutes when the watchful eyes turned away, the prince would feel a small, bright sound fold into his chest like a bird returning to a nest. It never lasted. A healer would cough, a guard would clear his throat, and the door would jerk open like a wound, letting in cold air, and with it the court's need for spectacle. The closeness forged in these tests drew them together and drove spikes between them. Their intimacy, once a warm secret, became a tool that others could pick up and examine. Jonan's hands, once free, were now measured and catalogued. He learned to adjust his breathing to coax a tone, to hum in hushed, obsessive syllables that sounded like prayers in an old tongue. Cale, for his part, began to anticipate the ways the world might sound, little patterns, a bell's accent, the cadence of horses pulling a cart, and this knowledge sharpened his senses in other directions. He could read footsteps like sentences, the scrape of a chair like punctuation. Yet each time the impossible sound flickered to life under Jonan's palm, it came with the heavy undertow of consequence. Pleasure and fear braided themselves into a rope that tightened with every small revelation. Outside the palace, the rumor mill turned into a millstone. A rival alpha from the west sent an envoy who was all teeth and silk, offering a marriage alliance to stabilize the throne. The implication was ugly and clear. Marry our heir, mix blood, ensure strength. Another pack's emissary hinted at old treaties that could be voided if the crown's son could not be trusted to lead. Meanwhile, within the palace, betas whispered their own calculations. Who might gain if the prince were deemed unfit? Who might raise banners? Who would seize the throne by the narrowest of margins?
Jonan watched all of this with something like nausea. He had come to the palace to steady hooves and learn the feel of reins, not to become a fulcrum for imperial ambitions. Each barter whispered around him felt like a guillotine's breath. There were nights he sat in the unused hayloft, his back against the rafters, and drew pictures in the dust with his fingertips. Horses, a sun, two figures holding hands. He'd blow the dust away and stare at the blank space, as if that could erase what was already sewn into his life. The sense of danger surrounding every... Jonan watched all of this with something like nausea. He had come to the palace to steady hooves and learn the feel of reins, not to become a fulcrum for imperial ambitions. Each barter whispered around him felt like a guillotine's breath. There were nights he sat in the unused hayloft, his back against the rafters, and drew pictures in the dust with his fingertips. Horses, a sun, two figures holding hands. He'd blow the dust away and stare at the blank space, as if that could erase what was already sewn into his life. The sense of danger surrounding every soft moment. Chaol, for his part, was learning to be both patient and impatient. There were nights he wanted to bolt from the palace and run until his legs gave out, to find a place where silence meant something different, a place where being mute was not a bargaining chip. Then he would remember the stable's warmth and Jonan's hands and the small, near-sacred sound that had begun to anchor him. He began to seek Jonan under cover of small errands and to invent reasons to visit the horses. Each time, the exchange felt both sacred and sacrilegious. They were two people living in the breath between politics and the body, and the breath tasted like both honey and iron. The tension between them grew tauter when Edrin began to parade potential brides through the palace. Daughters of allies, cousins of alphas, women clad in color and strategy. Each one came with promises and with eyes that scanned the prince's face for weakness, for the thing that might make their family the stronger branch. Chaol watched them, not out of interest, but as a man might watch the sky for incoming weather. He felt his father's disappointment like a physical thing, the way Edrin would not look his son in the face, or when he did, how his eyes would slide away, as if measuring the worth of a life and finding it lacking. Jonan saw this, and his gut nodded. When a daughter of a minor alpha came to learn the palace's ways, the stable boy poisoned himself with jealousy and an ugly clarity. If Chaol accepted this marriage, if the prince chose stability over the fragile, luminous thing that had started between them, then Jonan would be invisible again. Worse, he would be used as evidence of a miracle and then discarded. The thought made his chest ache in a way that made him want to spit. In the rapt hours before a testing day, Chaol lay awake, feeling the palace breathe like a living animal. He mouthed words he could not hear, and felt them with his lips like contraband. When Jonan came in, shoes soft, hair still damp from the river water he had chased the horses through, the prince's face softened with a vulnerability that almost undid him. They could not promise each other forever. They could not negotiate the politics that kept them apart. But they could promise small things, a touch, a shared joke that would be remembered in later loneliness. A carved whistle passed between them like a relic.
"Stay," Jonan said once, so low Chaol almost missed it. "How?" Chaol signed, the question simple and heavy. Jonan's fingers formed words like prayer. "By standing, by not letting them make you into what they want." It was as much a creed as a plea. Chaol pressed his forehead to Jonan's, and for a breath they were not prince and stable boy, but two hearts mapping how to breathe in a world that sought to ration their air. Outside, the palace hung. "Stay," Jonan said once, so low Chaol almost missed it. "How?" Chaol signed, the question simple and heavy. Jonan's fingers formed words like prayer. "By standing, by not letting them make you into what they want." It was as much a creed as a plea. Chaol pressed his forehead to Jonan's, and for a breath they were not prince and stable boy, but two hearts mapping how to breathe in a world that sought to ration their air. Outside, the palace hummed with plotting. Inside, in a small room with straw for a bed and a lantern that threw them both in partial light, two people learned how to build a life out of half sounds, sutured together with the only honest thing they had, each other. The pain of the world edged around them, sharp and real, and yet between them there was a tiny, fragile cathedral of sound and touch that no law could unmake, at least not yet. The morning the envoy from the Western Pax arrived, the palace felt like a throat knotted by winter. Courtiers moved with the precision of practiced actors. Petals were laid on ledgers as if to soften the bite of negotiations. Edrin received the envoy in a chamber hung with wolf banners. Chaol was required to stand with his shoulder near his father's, a living emblem. He could feel in the way the banners trembled and the Raven Guard shifted that the court expected him to be a prop. He learned to plant his feet and look small enough to be safe, large enough to be seen. The envoy was a woman in a gown like spilled coins. She smiled with teeth sharpened by pedigree and offered words like lacquered knives. "We bring a daughter of promise," she said, voice like silk. Her eyes flicked over Chaol with the casual appraisal of a merchant inspecting a ware stable. "She is strong in moonblood, obedient to the line, ready to be queen of your people's north." Edrin's jaw loosened into the recompense of a father who had been bargaining. The man in the crown measured the daughter-in-law like a tool. Chaol watched the way his father's fingers flexed on the table, mapping deals with a practiced grace. He read the room through the cadence of people leaning forward, the way alliances folded like paper to make room for money. His new hearing hummed at the edges of this choreography, the gentle scrape of the envoy's sleeve, the rustle of the coin bag by her hip. The sounds lined themselves into an accusation he couldn't yet name. This was a transaction, not a union. Jonan was kept away from the meeting. The palace rules tightened like a noose. He was told to remain in the stables under the pretext that his presence might disturb royal business. The stable boys watched him go with pity in their faces, some with envy. Jonan's hands, which had once felt like maps that read living things, had become an exhibit, an oddity observed from a distance. That night, Edrin summoned them both. The king's chambers smelled of iron and hay dust, as if the palace itself could not decide what was its true scent.
The queen attended the summons like a sentry of propriety, her lips thin as slitted windows. She looked at Chaol with sorrow that could be worn like jewelry, an ornament that looked good on a throne, but did not change the bone beneath. "You stood too close to him," Edrin said, voice low and even. He looked at Jonan as a man might look at a rumor he meant to extinguish. "You touched my son." Jonan's posture stiffened. He had imagined being chastised, but not with such ritualized contempt. "I only," he began, and the word faltered against the king's attention. "You only what?" Edrin asked. He had a way of tilting a question until it spilled blood. "You only risked treason? You only placed a human hand over the throat of the heir. Do you understand the implication of what you have done?" Chaol watched Jonan's face. There was no bluster there, only an honesty that was suddenly more dangerous than any lie. Jonan swallowed. "I helped him," he said simply. "I didn't mean—" "You will not speak without permission in this hall," Edrin snapped, and with that the space between them became an accusation. He turned his face to Chaol. "I can keep you from being used, or I can let you be used to make a treaty of what should not be mended. You must choose." The demand struck like a stone at the base of Chaol's throat. Choose. The word was an iron gate. He felt Jonan's knuckles pale where they rested on his knees. The boy was as afraid as a man can be and still stand. Chaol had imagined lectures, orders, exile maybe. He had not imagined this ultimatum wrapped in a bargain that smelled of funeral flowers. "I will choose for myself," signed Chaol, but his hands trembled. Edrin did not like that tremor. It wrote dissent on the young prince's skin. "I will not be a tool," he managed aloud, and the phrase sounded foreign in his mouth, grainy and thin. It was the first time he had raised his voice in the presence of the court since the tests began, and he felt it like a small rebellion. Edrin's eyes narrowed. "You are naive," he said. "You are cherished in the way of sons who have not yet proven the steel of their bone. But do not confuse fondness for strength. If you insist on complicating succession with sentiment, then I will do what any leader must do. I will secure the pack." Jonan stepped forward before he thought, and the queen's hand moved like a whip, striking his wrist with a velvet glove. "You will stay," she whispered, more tender than the king's roar. "There will be no contact. You will be out of the palace by dawn." The silence that followed tasted of smoke. They were not defeated so much as reclassified. Jonan, an expendable variable. Chaol, a problem to be sanitized or sacrificed. The procession of courtiers left quick and tidy, like tide withdrawing to expose a shoreline of consequences. The queen lingered by the door. Her eyes were softer than Edrin's, but even that softness carried the cold calculation of statecraft.
When the door shut, Jonan let out a sound that was not a sob, but the holding of one. He turned to Cale with rage pressed under his skin like tinder. "You said you would not be used," he said, voice frayed. "You said—" "You think I haven't tried?" Cale returned, the words signing themselves into the air like small flags. He could feel the anger sifting through his new sense of sound into something he did not yet control. The snap of the curtains, the beat of the clock in the hall. "They offered me a marriage," he confessed, and the admission was a blade. "They offered me a person like a ledger." Jonan's jaw clenched. "And you weighed it against me," he whispered, though his words were bitter and sharp as a thrown stone. "You thought of me, of us, as a risk to be managed." There was a pain in his voice that made the stable boy's usual steady warmth crack into splinters. He had not expected the court to turn him into a policy, but he also had not expected the prince to hold hesitation like a weapon. "You—" Cale started, and then stopped because he felt the truth like an animal in his chest. He had thought of the crown, of the way silence had been counted as liability, and he had allowed the thought of safety to brush his cheek like a scarf. It had not been betrayal at first, only survival. But survival, he now understood, could be a slow eraser of the self. Jonan backed away as if the prince's confession had struck him. "So you would choose the throne?" His hands were empty but gestured as if holding accusation. "When I hummed and coaxed and risked everything, you would choose a title over me?" The stable's rafters seemed to lean in on their words. The horses, startled by the sharpness, lifted their heads and stamped. Cale felt a guilty flare of panic. "Don't make it simple," he said, voice raw. "Don't make me explain things I can't—" He stopped because there was nothing to say that did not feel like a capitulation. Jonan's face was a study in hurt that hardened into something like resolve. "Then I will go," he said quietly. "If your world cannot hold me without bartering me, then I will be absent. I won't be your proof for a wedding, nor your solace between council sessions. I will leave before they can use me." The threat had a parliamentary finality. To leave the palace when the court watched was to close off any future Jonan might dare imagine. It was to remove himself from the possibility that Cale might choose him as the quiet fulcrum between politics and passion. It was, in Jonan's mind, protection. Remove the lever, and the machine cannot be used. Cale bolted to his feet. "No," he said, the single syllable a fracture in the night's glass. He shuffled toward Jonan like a man trying to catch a fleeing bird. "Don't go, please." Jonan laughed then, a small derisive sound. "You either choose the throne, or you choose me," he spat. "I won't be the reason you can be crowned."
If being with me costs your family's safety, then I'm not worth it. The hurt had been alloyed into a cold moral clarity. He set his shoulders like a soldier. "You will marry a woman who can carry on the law of the Pax, and I will leave without a farewell that softens the wound." Cale reached for him and found air. He had wanted to pledge a secret life, to carve small sanctuaries in the palace, to accept a love that required nothing of the world. But the world would insist on payment. The silence that had been his longed-for cloak now felt like a shroud. "If you go," he said, voice splintering, "I won't hear you again. I won't hear the way your laugh sounds over breakfast. I won't hear your curse when you slip on the stones." His hands moved desperately, signing language into the air as if they could stitch back what was being unpicked. Jonan's eyes flashed. For a moment, the walls between them were thin as tissue paper, and both saw the dangerous possibility. A life forged beyond the palace, small and honest, or a life gilded with crowns and emptiness. "We could run," Jonan said abruptly, the words tumbling out like something dangerous that had been locked up too long. "Run south. There are farms. There are people who would take my hands for the work and not the crown. We could leave at moonrise. No treaties would matter then." Cale's breath caught. He tasted the salt of the sea that did not exist in these courtyards, an image Jonan had conjured from stories. His new hearing caught the sweep of the curtains as if they were sails. For the first time, a real choice unfurled in front of him. A world where he was small but free, or a world where he was powerful but constrained. The image of his father's hand over the ledger, of the Pax bowing, wrenched at him like a hungry animal. But running would be treason to lineage, a crime that might drown not only them but the fragile peace of the northern wilds. It would also endanger Jonan,
Humans on the run are prey in a world where power is measured in teeth and law. The thought of what Edrin might do, hunt them as an example, burn a village for a lesson, gnawed like a wolf at his resolve. Jonan saw his hesitation, and his face closed like a book slammed shut. "I refuse to be a bargaining chip," he said. "If you will not leave with me, then I will leave alone." The door opened then, as if on cue, and the queen's cool voice slipped into the space. She had been listening at the door, as many mothers of kingdoms do. "Decisions are burdens," she said, folding her hands. "But they are also the measures of who a man is." She looked at Cale with an almost cruel tenderness. "You must learn to weigh the pack above personal whim." Jonan's hands clenched. He looked like a man trying to hold himself from raking. He pressed his palms into his eyes for a second, and when he looked up again, his resolve had become a kind of resignation. "Then I will go at dawn," he said softly.
Cale's world contracted until all that remained was the breath between them. He reached outward, not for the throne, not for strategy, but for the sturdy human hand he had learned to read and love. "Stay," he begged, as much an order as a wish. Jonan's fingers brushed his cheek in a touch that held sorrow and benediction. "I will stay as long as you will let me," he said. "Until dawn, until they drive me out, until you sign your name into being something you hate." The truth was a small, sharp thing lodged between them. He would stay until he couldn't. When Jonan left the chambers, the palace felt like a wound that had been pressed, but not stitched. Cale touched his hand where the boy's fingers had been, and for the first time, understood the hollow that would be left. He imagined Jonan walking away under a pale sky, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by stone. The new listening in him picked out a dozen small sounds, the distant clink of a guard's sword, the far-off howl of a wolf, each carving the shape of a future without the steady warmth of Jonan's presence. Secrets became fractures in that moment. Jonan's exile, whether chosen or enforced, would be the first crack. It would split loyalties in the court, force Edrin's hand into motions that could ignite war, and make Cale into the hinge upon which a kingdom might swing. The next days promised to be a cascade of betrayals and bargains, and the fragile bright thread between them would be stretched until it snapped or became steel. In the quiet that followed, Cale pressed his forehead to the oak table and listened, not to the beating of his own heart, but to the hollow thing the palace had become. He had dreamed, at an earlier age, of how it might feel to roar like the wolves in the high passes, to lead without doubt. Now the roar tasted like ash. The choice Edrin had demanded settled over him like winter. Be a prince made of obedience, or be a man who loved and lost. And somewhere between the hall's polished floors and the hollow of his chest, Cale recognized the shape of an ending forming. It was not yet a battle, the armies slept in their lairs, but it was the kind of wound that could not be healed by healers or seers. It would be stitched only by sacrifices, by betrayals made public, and by the fierce courage to claim a future that neither tradition nor terrors could predict. The air above the courtyard smelled like iron and rain, a weather turning against them, as if the sky objected to their small rebellion. Word moved faster than men. By twilight, the palace gates thrummed with a different kind of footfall, boots not of servitors, but of those who took the world by force, betas summoned to proof, a handful of huntsmen with faces like folded maps, and men from the west, slick emissaries who smiled like knives. Jonan's promise to leave had not been fulfilled.
He had stayed until the hour the moon rose fat and certain, and then he had gone anyway. Not to flee, but to bring back a ragged, stubborn crew of the stable boys' kin, and a pair of farmers who owed him both a debt and a loyalty. They came not as soldiers, but as witnesses, to a love that would not be bartered, to a human who would not be used. Edrin noticed the gathering as a dark note notices its counterpoint. He did not shout. He never needed to. He moved like a shadowed verdict toward the gathering crowd, each step a stone thrown into a hunted pond. At his back, the queen's face was a blade of practiced calm. Behind his shoulder, Cale felt everything break into sharper focus: the breath of men, the rust of leather, the small clicking of reins. His new hearing, still raw, picked out the tremor in Jonan's voice like a thread, and the wild, brittle hope braided through it. "You will take him away," Edrin said to Jonan, with the flat cruelty of a man naming a punishment. "No more contact. He will be sequestered until we decide a marriage that will seal the North." Jonan stepped forward, not with the swagger of a man who thought himself safe, but with the kind of steadiness that had been carved from winter work and hard days. "Hell not be reduced to an instrument of policy," he answered, voice low but clear. "He's a man, and damned if I'll be a lesson to teach you about what a human is worth." Court laughter rippled like rust, sharp and tailored. Edrin's hand curled. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then a man at the edge, one of the Western Envoy's braggarts, lunged, a quick, cruel motion meant to settle any insolence by puncture. The blade caught sunlight and the world jerked. Time narrowed. Jonan moved as if pulled by a rope of instinct he had not known he possessed. He threw himself between the swing and Cale. The blade found shoulder instead of throat. A sound left Jonan's mouth, a jagged thing of surprise, and then pain. He went down like a cart losing a wheel, and the courtyard smelled of iron before anyone could name the word. Cale's world split open. Hearing, for the first time in a long litany of half-truths, became a river that did not stop at edges. He heard the wet gasp of Jonan's breath, the dull thud of a body hitting stone, the furious bark of Edrin's command, the chant of betas rallying like wolves answering a call. And beneath it all, an utterly human sound. Jonan's small, stubborn laugh in the moment between pain and protest arrived with the clarity of a bell. It cut through Cale like a blade, and then became the sword he seized. He moved before his father could name a punishment, before a guard could comprehend why the prince would cross the threshold of law. He stepped over the stable-boy-turned shield and pressed his forehead to Jonan's, needing presence more than breath. The new sense that had come to him in small private stitches now roared into being. He felt Jonan's pulse like a drumline and matched it with his own.
He heard every ragged inhalation and made it a map. "Get him out!" Cale cried, a sound like a cracked bell, but fierce enough to cause an old wolf to stir. It was the first time his voice had been used as more than a tool of politics. It had a personal ownership to it that startled the court. Men obeyed because the command was sudden, and because the presence behind it was no longer merely emblematic, but vital. Guards scooped Jonan up. The human's wound bled warm and bright. The courtyard blurred into a scene of urgent motion. Edrin's face changed somewhere between fury and calculation. The king's hands were capable of both cradle and clasp. For years they had closed on tribes and treaties like a smith closing a hot metal to shape it. Now they hovered like a choice. "Cale," Edrin said, voice low, as if he could keep storms in a whisper. "This is why we cannot allow such weakness at our center. You put yourself above the law." Cale did not answer the accusation. The sound of Jonan's blood against skin had braided itself into his hearing until it felt like a second language. The prince did not think of succession or treaty. He thought only of the human whose laugh had become the keystone of his private world. He reached out, and without permission, without ceremony, he took Jonan's hand in both of his. The touch was not a prince's concession, but a claim. "You hurt him," Cale said. The words were small but true. "You will not hurt him again." The courtier shifted, and something like a collective intake brushed the air. Edrin's jaw tightened until it was a line. Then, in a move that shocked even those who knew him best, he bit back a verdict and straightened with the mechanics of a man deciding to alter a map because a new peak had revealed itself. The healers pressed forward then, the king's authority reshaping into paternal command. They worked with hands that had practiced on broken bones and bitter hearts. Jonan thrashed between consciousnesses and laughed once, absurdly, when a healer splashed cold water on his face. You'll think twice next time about biting a prince, he rasped, and the laugh was a torn, brave thing. Days that followed were washed in a strange, tender fury. Jonon survived the wound. Its scar was a white crescent that traced the line of sacrifice he had laid over his life. He healed because the healers found no poison in the blade, and because, perhaps, something else mended faster than stitches, the court's understanding of what the prince's heart held. Stories spread, softened at the seam, that the prince had claimed a human publicly, and that the king had not executed either. Some called it folly, others called it law rewritten. But the true reclamation was quieter and no less seismic. Within the palace walls, Chaol used the moment of public peril to speak not as a prince polished for diplomacy, but as a man who had felt the precise vibration of another's breath in his bones.
He stood on the terrace, the night wind brushing his hair like an old friend, and he called the Pax. He did not roar in the way tradition ordained for the Alpha's son, loud, practiced, ritualized. He did what his life had taught him to do. He listened to rhythm, to cadence. He matched Jonon's breath in a low, deliberate sound, and in that sound was a claim. "I will not be an ornament," he told the gathered leaders, his voice steady and oddly sure now. "I will be someone who can hear the world in more languages than one. We will change how law binds us. Humans who give their lives for the pack will not be pawns. They will be allies." There were scoffs. There were knives in the glances of men who counted power by blood. But there were also pauses, shifts in the air like the first soft thaw of spring. Edrin watched, and for the first time the king's face softened with a human doubt. He had founded his rule on unbending lines. The son's public claim pulled at those lines with an insistence he had not expected. To break tradition was to risk instability. To allow compassion was to admit a weakness. He weighed both and found them heavier than a ledger. Jonon, scar still raw but spirit inflamed, opened his mouth then, not to speak of treaties or law, but to say the single thing that had animated his risk. "I would stand in the rain to hear him laugh," he said plainly. The words landed like a small oath. That confession changed the calculus for some. For others, it became an accusation. But the most important thing was that it had been said aloud, and in saying it, Jonon reclaimed himself from the court's objectification. He had not been a miracle to be marketed. He had been a man who had loved and had been willing to die for that love. The world could not unsee him. Redemption came in the form of choices, not treaties. Edrin, warned by battle and memory, found a way to temper law with mercy. Jonon was not exiled. He would not become a prince beside Chaol. The Pax were not yet ready for that revolution. But he was allowed, by decree shaky and revolutionary, to remain in the palace as a recognized ally of the royal household, a human whose hands could touch the prince without penalty. It was not a full reconciliation of worlds, but it was a foothold. Jonon could have demanded more. He could have demanded marriage, rank, a promise forged in code. Instead, he gave Chaol a simpler, fiercer gift. On a night after the wound had scabbed and hearth fires burned low, Jonon led the prince down to the stable. The horses watched like old gods. Under the moon's indifferent eye, Jonon pressed his palm to Chaol's throat and hummed, the same low, silly sound that had first pulled a world of noise into the prince's bones. This time, Chaol let it bloom like a bell, and he answered with a laugh that was whole and certain. "I will not be your secret," Chaol whispered, fingers laced with Jonon's, "nor your shield. We will be what we choose." If the Pax have to learn a new law, they will do it because we live by it. Jonon's hand shook. He had given a piece of himself in the courtyard. Now he gave a different piece, a willingness to stay and to fight in smaller, weary ways. It was a sacrifice made not through blood, but through patience. The palace did not become Eden overnight. Rival Pax spat and schemes rippled like oil on water. But the small publicness of Jonon's wound and Chaol's refusal to let fear dictate his choices created a new axis. Alliances shifted, slightly, as men who had once counted lineage above heart reconsidered the fabric of loyalty. It would be a long forging, a slow remapping of law and habit. But under the moonlight, hands clasped in a stable smelling of hay and old rain, the two of them made a promise that was both a treaty and a prayer, that love could be the thing by which a crown learned to listen. And when the first true howl rose months later, the prince and his father standing side by side as Pax answered to a new cadence, it was not a single voice, but a chorus. Somewhere in that chorus was Jonon's small, human laugh,
threaded through with the hush of horses and the rhythms of ordinary life. Edrin heard it, and, for the first time since a war had carved the northern wilds, he did not turn away. He let the sound move through him like wind through tree, and found, to his own astonishment, that there was room in his rule for both tradition and a different kind of justice. They would pay for those choices. There would be nights of hunger, of whispered barters, of men who thought power was a thing to hoard. But in the tender, irreducible core of their world, two hands clasped under a pale moon, one scarred and the other steady, something had shifted. It was small, but it was enough. A human had changed a prince's hearing, and a prince had changed a kingdom's heart. The cost had been high, the sacrifice real. Yet redemption lived in the fierce, stubborn next breath, and it was theirs to claim. The months that followed settled like weather, sometimes storm, sometimes clear, and they learned to live inside both. Jonin kept his place at the palace, not as a prize nor a servant, but as a named ally, a human who had laid down his body for another, and who, by that act, forced the court to make room. He traded nights of wild laughter against mornings of quieter vigilance. He taught hunters to respect a stable boy's worth, and taught Kale to name things in sound when the prince's hearing flickered. In time, the palace no longer rounded their edges away from each other as though by habit. The halls remembered to soften. Edrin did not become gentle. A man who had won lands with ferocity cannot unmake his temper overnight. But the king did learn to weigh his decrees with a different hand. He watched his son not as a ledger item, but as a man whose choices bore consequence for the realm and its humanity.
He came once to the stable at dawn and stood awkwardly by the rafters while Kale swung a lead rope with easy competence. The two men, father and son, spoke with the halting grace of those who had once believed in only one language. It was not reconciliation so much as a new, wary respect. Edrin's silence around Jonin softened into a protective watchfulness. In private, the king allowed pride to creak like old armor that had been polished. Rival packs hissed and schemed as rivals will. Some bars were closed, others loosened. Bloodlines were still the currency of the North. Yet the story of the human who had saved a prince and the prince who had refused to barter his heart became a caution and an invitation. Power could be tempered by mercy, and mercy, if wielded rightly, could be a weapon against dogma. Alliances shifted, grudges were rerouted, and in small ways the wilds learned a new grammar. Jonin carried his scar like a map. Sometimes he smiled at it, and sometimes it ached with memory, but always it reminded him of what he had chosen. Kale learned to speak, not only with the new clarity that had come to him, but with a language that honored both wolf and human, measured, listening, fierce. They married no treaty, no parade. There was no grand ceremony to recast law, but they made promises that mattered, public gestures of care, small decrees that protected human allies, and an insistence that the palace should reflect the world beyond its stone. The last image of that season was simple and impossible to forget. On a ridge above the palace, with the moon a deliberate coin in the sky, Kale and Jonin stood side by side. Beneath them, Pax answered to a call reshaped by a voice that now included human laughter. Kale pressed his palm to Jonin's scar in a way that was tenderness and claim both. Jonin leaned his head against Kale's shoulder and breathed their joined rhythm into the night. The howl that rose them was not just an alpha's command, it was an acceptance song, ragged and brave, a chorus that learned to hold more than one kind of sound. They had paid dearly for that chorus. They would pay again. But on that ridge, with the wind combing their hair and the world spread raw and promising beneath them, there was a new law at work. Love as defiance, listening as power. In that quiet, the kingdom learned to bend. And the two of them, hands interlaced, breaths synchronized, were exactly where they had chosen to be.